Hello, and thank you again for joining us this afternoon. My name is Rakia Ramsey, and I'm the Will Director here at WAND, who, together with my program manager, Samantha Blake, serves as your main point of contact for all things Will. And as we are in the thick of our annual budget letter campaign, in today's webinar, we will talk broad strokes about the pending federal budget in front of Congress right now and answer any and all questions you may have about it or how you can lobby Congress to shift spending priorities from the Pentagon and to more social and economic programs, which are sorely needed in our communities. And so just a brief note here about WAND and Will. As a Will member and a state women legislator, we feel that it is important to give this knowledge to you so that you can speak intelligibly about the budget and how it impacts your communities and your constituents. So today we are joined by my friend and colleague, Mackenzie or Mac Hamilton, our WAND Advocacy Director, and Erica Fein, who some of you may remember, who I also consider a friend, who now serves as the Senior Washington Director at Win Without War. And so just to give a brief introduction for our panelists today, prior to joining Win Without War, Erica served as the Director of Government Affairs and Nuclear Weapons Policy Director here at WAND, and she led campaigns to limit the excessive US nuclear weapons arsenal while she was here. Thank you, Erica. She's also served as the legislative assistant to former Congressman John Dingell, where she handled national security, foreign policy, and veteran affairs, among other issues. Thank you for joining us, Erica, once more. Our own advocacy director, Mac, works with WAND's grassroots and organizational partners to advance legislative efforts to reduce military spending, promote nuclear disarmament, and advance peaceful conflict resolution. Prior to joining us here at WAND, she served as the executive manager of the student-led movement to end mass atrocities, or STAND, where she collaborated with youth leaders in the US, the UK, France, and Rwanda to work to prevent genocide and mass atrocities around the world. So thank you, Mac, for being here and helping us with our discussion today. So with that, I will take no more time and turn it over to your capable hands, Mac, to go ahead and get us started.
Hey, thanks so much for that kind introduction, Rakia, and very happy to be here with Erica. Erica and I worked together in a coalition around ending US complicity in the war in Yemen. And I believe you continue to work on that along with a host of other issues. So I'm happy to be here with you and always learn so much from our conversations. So thanks a lot for joining and lending us your expertise here. So as we transition into this conversation, I want to highlight a few key issues that we're seeing across the board in conversations about US budgeting priorities, and particularly defense priorities. And I'm sure these themes will be coming up again and again throughout this conversation. And I'll be working closely with Rakia and Sam in the coming months to work with Will legislators to be sure that you all have the information you need to stay up to date on how discussions on these issues are proliferating and unfolding in DC. So those key issues are the rise of China as a core threat and the rise or resurgence of great power competition in global politics. The issue of nukes and nuclear modernization as key to US defense and protection of the homeland, and the continuation of the military industrial complex in US society. And then for us, how we begin to unravel that. And then the last issue is budgeting our values and really thinking about what it means to be investing all of our hard-earned tax dollars in defense priorities rather than in the things that really make our communities healthy and make them well. So the first question I'd like to start with for you, Erica, is just kind of in broad strokes. Could you talk about what are some of the key elements of the Biden budget that Win Without War and your partners are most concerned about?
Sure, I'm happy to. And first of all, I just want to say thank you for having me today. It's really great to be back, even virtually, with WAND and Will and I spent some really fun years at WAND working on nuclear disarmament and the Pentagon budget, and learned so much when I was working with women legislators to, sort of really translate these issues for public consumption. So Win Without War, does a very, very similar work to WAND, as for those who may not be as familiar. And we really work on US foreign policy and work to make it more progressive. But I would say one of our core issues is ending the unaccountable waste at the Pentagon, ending excessive budgets, and because really the budget is the driver, is one of the core drivers of US militarism. And essentially there's just endless amounts of money to go to war, to create new weapons, and those dollars then don't get spent on things that really provide national security. So the Biden budget request for fiscal year 2022 is at $753 billion. That's a $12.5 billion increase from the previous fiscal year. And I think one of the things that you'll hear over and over again from defense hawks, and that sort of trickles out into the ether, is that somehow it's a cut because it doesn't keep pace with inflation. But here's the thing to really keep in mind. $12.7 billion is $4 billion more than the entire budget of the CDC. The thing, that one of the main agencies that we're relying on to keep us safe during this pandemic, and that, everyday people in this country rely on to make sure that our communicable diseases are under control. So, we're talking about a massive increase, all things considered, to the budget. And that's on top of, really out of control spending in the Trump years. I say this kind of often, but when I was working on the budget when I was at WAND, we were talked about how $600 billion was too much money. That was sort of the level we were at, like 630 or so. That was the level that the Obama budgets were at. And so, when Trump came into office, there were, pretty terrible grand bargain that was struck that increased spending by $100 billion. And that, did a lot of damage to our mission to end US militarism at home and abroad. The sort of, as you asked in broad strokes, 50% of the budget goes to 50% of the Pentagon budget goes to federal contractors. And a lot of that goes to CEO pay, along with, their own sort of stock dividends and the shareholder money that they get. A lot of that also, millions of those dollars go to defense contractor CEOs. And so I think that's something that everyday people aren't sort of thinking, well, my tax dollars are being used to pay a person who's making weapons that kill other people millions and millions of dollars. And that's an outrage. We're talking about 12 billion for the F-35. We're talking for 85 new F-35s, which is an aircraft that has already cost over $1 trillion and has so many issues. It's kind of, as some people would call it, a hunk of junk. And it's, a plane that may never fly to its full capacity. And yet we're spending, all of this money this year, $12 billion more to procure more. When we talk about that, what we're really talking about is a Pentagon budget that is accountable to no one. there are just, countless amounts of weapons programs that are, the weapons themselves don't function as they intended. The cost overruns are ginormous. They're never, the weapons are never done as intended and never done on time. And yet, Congress continues to fund them year after year. And, to a certain degree, the executive branch will request more than is needed or more than is realistic. But, it's called the military industrial congressional complex for a reason. Congress is addicted to this spending right now. And it's really our job to change that over the long term. So I'll stop there and we can get into more details moving forward.
Yeah, that's, I think, a great framing of, just what are these overarching issues and what we've seen unfold over time, and what we're seeing continue. And I think that's really important for you all as women legislators to be thinking about, is what this funding could do in your particular communities. Should we divest from these particularly private interests that are involved in our defense? So the next question I have is kind of digging into the defense budget in particular. Are there things that you at Win Without War and folks you're in community with that you are feeling are a bit of a lost cause at this moment as you're watching congressional hearings and talking to members of Congress, versus where do you think there's opportunity to make particular cuts in the budget as we go into the appropriations and authorization processes?
Sure. Yeah, I think that it's really important to sort of step back and not think about sort of where individual cuts going to happen, because for the reasons that we're stalled on infrastructure and we're stalled on police reform and abolition. The current makeup of the Congress is such that there are not 60 votes in the Senate to cut anything, and there are not 218 votes in the House to cut anything. So what we're looking at, in my opinion, this year is to hold back increases to the budget. As sad and absurd as that may sound, there will be attempts, more than one attempt, to add money above the $753 billion request. And that's partially because every year the military services send up what are called unfunded priorities that don't go in the regular budget, but they're, sort of additional wish list items that it would be nice if we could get these things. And so we're really looking to do two things: really push the narrative momentum that has been generated over the course of the last few years, but really the last year when the, sort of the grassroots really mobilized around a 10% cut. And we can sort of talk about what does a 10% cut mean. But so we want to really make sure that that narrative stays alive. And so we need to continue to focus on reducing the top line and talking about weapons contractors, holding them accountable, talking about broken weapons programs, all while we're playing defense against increases in cuts.
I think that's great. And actually, would you like to delve into a little bit more about the 10% cuts? Because I know there are some legislators who are a bit concerned. I guess I'm thinking Trump era cuts across the board can be harmful in different industries. How are you talking about this to different congressional offices, and how might our women legislators be thinking about this as they're considering their advocacy?
Sure. Yeah. So last year, just to back up, last year there was an effort in both the House and the Senate to cut 10% of the Pentagon budget. In the Senate, it was led by Senator Sanders, Warren, and Markey. and in the House by Representatives Barbara Lee and Mark Pocan. And there was a lot of real enthusiasm generated around the cut. It was in the middle of, this raging pandemic that had already claimed so many victims. And the end result was the Senate got over half of the Democratic caucus voted for it. And in the House, it wasn't quite as many overall, that, it wasn't half the caucus, but there were more people that voted for the 10% cut last year than voted for a 1% cut a few years earlier. So when we talk about, what is a 10% cut, I'm going to share my screen because I think it's kind of worth visualizing some of this. So let me just try and share my screen really quickly. Okay, this is, can you see it? Oh, wait. All right, so this is really nothing fancy here. I just gonna run through some examples, and sometimes it's easier to read with me. The Institute for Policy Studies, the National Priorities Project, put together this list of what you could get for a 10% cut. And I think it's just like incredible to see these things. So we could end homelessness with just cutting 10% of the Pentagon budget. We could house every one of the more than 500,000 homeless people in this country with money to spare. You could create more than 1 million good jobs in cities like Flint, Michigan, that desperately need new infrastructure. We could close the racial equity gap in schools, because there's, apparently a $23 billion funding gap between majority white and majority non-white school districts. $23 billion, that's, if we're talking about a 10% cut to the Pentagon budget, we're talking about around 73, 74, $75 billion. I mean, you could do more than one of these things. And that's something that should be astounding and sort of devastating to us. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and, hopefully folks will visit this page and explore this further. But I shared that to sort of say, you asked me how we're talking about it. I mean, you've got to focus on, the fact that the Pentagon budget is not, particularly what we saw with coronavirus and, the real national security threats that we face. The Pentagon budget isn't the thing that's keeping our communities safe. And in fact, if we just spent a little bit of that money on other things, we would be reaping dividends and really, doing the things that we say that our government cares about, instead of enriching defense contractors. And to your question about, how do across the board cuts, how should we be talking about them? Because there's a concern that, just chopping 10% off of the top line, is harmful. I actually kind of call BS on that. I think it's a little bit of a cop out. I think it's really, really, really easy to sort of say, we don't know where that 10% would come from, so we don't want to do an across the board cut, when in reality, it could come from 3 programs. It could come from the F-35, the LCS, and nuclear weapons, and we'd be good to go. We could devise a million different ways that we could cut the Pentagon budget by 10%, but we need our members of Congress to say, yes, I'm ready to do that. And as of yet, unfortunately, they haven't been. But we also know that our grassroots, that people out in this country are there. So this is really one of those cases where the Hill needs to catch up with the public.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think those examples that you gave, we'll be sure to share the link to the IPS website to all of our WIL members. But I think those really humanize these dollars. And I think we can all think about members of our community who would really benefit from that very real redistribution of defense dollars. And I would say too, like, I totally agree with you in terms of, when there's a will, there's a way. And it's not our job to figure out where the cuts are, right? That's, there's hundreds and thousands of people in the Washington bureaucracy that is their job to do that. So we should push them to figure out where those cuts can happen. So that's great. I'd love for you to delve a little bit into the budget timeline for us. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening? And are there particular moments that state legislators should be paying close attention to as we're looking to influence the budgeting process?
Sure. Yeah, I wish I could give a really concrete answer, but there are things that are like a bit in flux this year just because presidential transition year, plus they're trying to figure out this supplemental spending on top of, additional the much needed stimulus that happened earlier this year, right? We're talking about a big jobs plan and potentially two. So I just say that all of that to say that, there's still a bit that's up in the air. And, when we talk about influencing members of Congress, their time is really going to be divided right now. And so much of it is going to be focused on not, the regular appropriations process, but the infrastructure / jobs bill. But with all of that said, let's talk about it. So there are really, every year there are essentially 4 opportunities to, well, I was going to say 4, but I realized there's actually, a bit more than that. But when we talk about so let's talk about the authorization and appropriations process. So when we talk about when Congress votes on defense spending, we're talking about the National Defense Authorization Act. Then we're also talking about the Defense Appropriations Act. And we're talking about the Energy and Water Appropriations Act, which is where nuclear weapons are funded out of. And so and then the House and the Senate are each taking up their own bills on their own, authorization and appropriations bills. So what we're looking at right now is in the House, as they have done, pretty much every year since Dems took back the House, they're trying to get all of their spending bills done before the August recess. So that's going to leave them, very few legislative days to get a bunch of spending bills done. There'll be sort of, I think, a truncated, it'll be very, very quick and rapid fire succession between, now and the end of July to get bills out of committee and off the floor as well. And what that means for us is that we're going to have, very little opportunity, I think, to really fully influence that process. I don't mean to be a naysayer, but, as I said before, I think we're sort of looking at not a lot of places where we know we can get cuts in the budget. And so there may be places in the defense or energy and water appropriations bills where we can look at like reforms and sort of funding limitations or reporting requirements, but not necessarily big cuts that will pass, right? So we can also talk about this in terms of, are there places where we want to try to cut these weapons? So there's that in the House. The House is also working on, the House will also take up its defense policy bill, which is also known as the National Defense Authorization Act, in September. September 1st is the target date for the committee work. And then before the end of September will be the target date for that bill to go on the floor. So I will say that that's probably more of where there will be, a lot of big, robust debates and work to maybe do a big, big push around a top line cut or a big weapon system cut that lowers the top line. And I think some of that remains to be seen. But I know, WAND and Win Without War will work closely together to make sure that the public knows and that, our will legislators know that, what the opportunity is there. And then really quickly, the Senate is, in terms of the defense authorization bill, the Senate will be taking that up in committee in July. I think we don't know sort of beyond that what, what their schedule is. But we also don't know, and this is sort of common every year, we don't actually know when they're taking up their spending bills. The House usually goes first because of the Constitution on spending bills. The Senate is, slower, and sometimes they decide it doesn't make sense to take up their bills because of the sort of grand bargain that happens in the end because Congress is kind of broken. So I know that that's not a super satisfying answer, but I will say, I think take heart in that we are paying attention, and at the earliest possible point, we will alert everyone to here's the big moment and here's when we would like you to weigh in.
That's awesome. That's a super helpful overview. And yeah, just to note too, the Senate is like duking it out over the infrastructure bill. So they're thinking about money, but the budgeting process is relatively secondary at the moment until it needs to be front and center. That's
Mac,
great.
Can I ask you a question really quick?
Yeah, please.
I'm wondering if there's anything to share on the sea launched cruise missile and how that is how you all are thinking about that in terms of the larger Pentagon budget fight.
For sure. So this is an interesting issue that I know Win Without War has worked on as well. One of the particular concerns we have with the nuclear specific part of the budget is the sea launched cruise missile, we call it the SLCM in the community. And this is what is called a low yield nuclear weapon, which means that it would cause less damage than traditional nuclear weapons. And this weapon was it was retired by the Obama administration, and it was taken off of high alert by the H.W. Bush administration. So both Democratic and Republican administrations have expressed concern about it over time. And President Trump brought it back into his budget. And so we're very disappointed to see that President Biden has included it in his budget. The Navy has even said that they don't want this missile and that it's not their key priority when it comes to naval defense. So we're really disappointed to see it in the budget. We think that it's a really easy thing to cut out of the budget and at a significant lifetime price tag as well. So we're working with several different organizations to try to influence that process, particularly with the chairwomen of the relevant appropriations committees. So if will legislators are interested in zooming in on that particular issue and things like op-eds, if you'd like to raise that in lobby meetings with your federal legislators, we would love to work with you on that. And I don't know if you have anything to add about it, Erica.
Thanks. No, I asked you because I know that it's something that, that we're going to have a fight on this year. And my only other thing that I would add is, I have high hopes that ultimately we will win this fight. And it's just a matter of, a little bit more time. It's unfortunate that the administration included it in their budget request because of the history that you laid out. And, the hope is that after they sort of do what's known as their nuclear posture review, that they'll decide once again that this is, a dangerous weapon that's not needed in the arsenal. And we can get back to fighting about the even bigger weapons that are in the nuclear arsenal that we really need to take out.
Absolutely. And we'll be continuing to work on those things. I think a thing that we're trying to put front and center is that, until there is a nuclear posture review, we should not even be thinking about appropriating money to new weapons, right? Like, we need to understand what is the Biden administration's end game and what's their long-term vision when it comes to nuclear issues. And until then, why are we funneling in money to a weapon that we might not even decide to develop down the road? That's a huge waste of money that could be spent in any of the many areas you outlined earlier. So absolutely agreed on that. So my next question for you is really kind of zooming in on state legislators in particular. I think it's helpful for us to understand what happens in DC, and you having worked for Congressman Dingell in the past, you're intimately familiar with what happens when there's interplay between state legislators and federal ones. So I'd love to just hear your perspective on why state legislators' voices matter in this process and what are the best ways to be heard.
Sure. I feel a little bit presumptuous, sort of saying this, but because I think that our state legislators know this, but there's a lot of power in the relationship between the state legislators and the members of Congress. And I mean, there's a little bit of, you have to be in the same party, but from my experience, state legislators are the eyes and ears of the district and or state, as it were. And you all have really, really valuable information that a member might not have because they're, not always, they're splitting their time between their home and the place that they represent and Washington. So I know that when I worked for the congressman, he always took calls from state legislators and from local officials, prioritized those. And I would venture to guess that that's true of most members of Congress in the House and the Senate. And I think also state legislators' voices are crucial, validating voices in your home communities. So writing op-eds, writing letters to the editor, staying engaged through sort of communicating in whatever medium, TikTok videos, whatever, communicating these messages and making them sort of, these are issues that we know that will legislators care deeply about. And the question is always, how do you communicate them to the public? And so, I think that's where you all come in and, can help do that. And to me, we need so much more of this to get out there. And, I know that, like, particularly when I was at WAND, Will played a key role on the Iran nuclear deal. And that was a tremendous, I think at the time, the Obama administration noted how valuable women state legislators were in sort of doing what I just said and calling their members of Congress and meeting with them and communicating to the public where, there were swing members at the time. So I just have seen firsthand that that state legislators play a really valuable role in these public debates, even if they don't really sort of if they feel like national issues. But I think we can always make them feel more connected to the community.
That's great. And I know many of you have been reaching out to us, being interested in writing an op-ed for, one of the papers in your district. We'd love to continue to work with all of you to make that big media splash, because it really does make a huge difference. I always tell advocates this too, you know, when offices are looking at their press clips in the morning, you know, every time a member of Congress's name is mentioned, that goes to the full staff of the office. And so it's a really important way to lobby. They're taking the temperature check every day of what's being said in the district. So that's great. So as you've highlighted, the defense budget is a huge part of our discretionary budget, and it's been that way for years. And I know many of us were hoping for a dramatic shift once President Trump was voted out of office. Why has that not been the case? Isn't this a big moment that, you know, the Democrats could be sharing a different vision for how tax dollars are spent? What's that all about, and what are some of the trade-offs you see being made?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a really big missed opportunity, but I also will say that I'm not at all surprised that this is the direction that we're in. I don't think that also all hope is lost. I think we need to wait a little bit of time for next year's budget request to really sort of see exactly where the wind is blowing. But I will say, as a candidate, you know, candidate Biden never talked about transforming the federal, you know, Pentagon spending, nor did he really talk about sort of big transformational change in the national security space. So in some ways, we're exactly where we thought we would be, and we have to really, you know, really recognize that and sort of game out what that means for us. So, you know, to me, that means we're really still in a moment where we're not pushing on an open door. We're pushing, we definitely have friendlier people to talk to, and, you know, we can get meetings at the White House and actually have people who really want to listen to us and want to hear our thoughts and ideas. But, and, you know, I'm not just saying that because there's sort of, you know, because he's a Democrat, because of course both of our organizations are nonpartisan, but you know, because there's just actual, you know, people that are doing policy and really, you know, actually doing the work in this administration, and you know, not trying to enrich the president in the process. When we talk about trade-offs, I mean, there are so many things to say. I think there's a lot of cautiousness happening. There's a lot of sort of hand-wringing about losing the House and the Senate in 2022, and you know, not wanting to sort of hang, you know, moderate members out to dry. And some believe that, you know, by taking on big transformational Pentagon, you know, the changing the Pentagon budget, you know, would be seen as too radical. And I think we wouldn't actually know that unless it was actually tested and tried out. And I think, you know, there's a lot of polling that says that the public wants to see, you know, defense cuts, and certainly do not want to see the Pentagon budget grow. And in particular, you know, when we talk about a 10% cut, we're really only talking about, you know, not kind of a drop in the bucket, but that's still a lot of money that could go to other priorities. So, yeah, I think that we, I think that we're seeing trade-offs being made, not just in this space. Another thing that I would note is that, you know, President Biden talked about, you know, getting back to, you know, getting America back, America's presence back in the world. You know, I think he even might have said a few times, like, America's back. And, you know, what that means for him is sort of a different thing than it means shoring up our allies and, you know, sort of going back to the status quo ante, when, you know, our reality, our lived reality is that that status quo was harming people was harming people all over the world. It was harming people in the United States and, you know, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, right? So, and in Iran. So we have a lot of work to do is the bottom line. And you know, like we can't sugarcoat it. We have a lot of work to do to really put people at the center of our foreign policy and national security, and not special interests.
That's great. And I think that leads well into my final question before we open up to our legislators for questions. I feel like we learned during the Obama years that it's really easy to get complacent on issues like foreign policy, especially when there's progress being made on particular pieces of domestic policy that we're really excited about, for example, the infrastructure bill. And I'm wondering if you have takeaways of things that we can learn from the Obama years, and how do you think groups like Win Without War and WAND can ensure that there's a continued sense of urgency when in a way we've won, right? Like, you know, we have someone in power who, you know, is investing in human needs a lot more than the last administration, at least. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think like the thing that I'll say about, you know, we're in a different time, and this is also not going to be a satisfying answer, but this is really about building over the long term. And so what we did over the last 4 years means that we're in a different place than where we were, you know, after the Bush era. And there was sort of a sigh of relief. George W. Bush is out of office. We now have, you know, a more liberal president, and, you know, the focus was on healthcare, and, you know, there was a huge economic crisis. So some parallels, but there was, I mean, there really wasn't nearly as much, you know, President Obama ended the Iraq War in 2011, and you know, the rest was pretty bad. I think we're in a different place because of groups like ours that are not willing to roll over and are willing to say the hard things that and like really hold folks accountable. And I think, you know, in some ways, like a lot of President Biden has surrounded himself with are people who have been doing foreign policy for decades for him in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and in the Senate when he was, you know, not the chairman of that committee. And so again, this is going to be really, really hard, but you know, we were able to help shift the conversation around what does national security actually mean. And we have to continue to say those things over and over and over again, and, you know, be willing to sort of stand up to this administration when we think that they're falling down. And of course, it also means praising them when they do the right thing. I mean, it's politically popular to end US, you know, military, the military invasion of Afghanistan. And you know, we said that President Biden is doing the right thing by you know, removing our troops from that country. And, you know, the sort of violence that will ensue is horrific to think about and is already happening. And we also have to recognize that, you know, US military violence was causing a lot of harm as well in that country. And so again, this is, you know, it's really about not being afraid to push back on this administration and this Congress. And what we really have to be doing is continuing to build power as, you know, as we're sort of trying to make progress at the same time.
Great. Well, I think we're going to open up to some questions from the audience. I've seen a couple roll in, so I'm just going to kick it off with our first one, which I think is a pretty common question, which is how would you counter arguments about patriotism and supporting our troops while discussing cutting the defense budget? Can you be both kind of pro-troop and pro-veteran while advocating for Pentagon cuts?
Yeah, this is a great question. Absolutely, you can be pro-troop and pro-veteran. First of all, this budget will give our troops a 2.5% pay raise, and that's been true of almost every year. The troops will be getting a pay raise, and when we talk about cutting the budget, we should be excluding personnel. And that is what the amendments have done, have excluded personnel from those cuts, because and healthcare, because we need to be supporting our troops. But we're supporting our troops by we've got to get away from this notion that more money means support, and more money for the budget overall, not more money for them. And there's a lot to be said for, U.S. service members being in war zones for years and years at a time. We've had these crises of personnel and retention, and a lot of fatalities due to training mishaps that have happened, because we've been at war for over 20 years. And so that's not really supporting our troops. We have to get out of these endless wars if we want to support our troops. And I think, there's also the case that we'll be supporting our veterans, because our veterans are suffering, our active duty, and the people who have left service are, suffering from a lot of the fallout of these wars, including, really, really terrible post-traumatic stress disorder. And, we've got to be taking care of the people that put their lives on the line. But one of the ways is by, stopping putting our troops in harm's way in ways that, unfortunately, are not actually about, the safety and security of our country, or any other country for that matter.
Absolutely agreed. And I think this morning, the Cost of War Project shared data around the suicide rate of our service members, and it massively, I think by 200 or 300%, way more deaths happened by suicide than actually in combat. And so I think that that's really a key thing to remember, is by making sure that service people are not in harm's way, we are taking away that potential for PTSD, right?
Right. So important.
Yeah, well, I'm going to ask you one more question. You've been so generous with your time before we close out. And that is, how do you think we can connect this issue to the larger issue of money in politics and government transparency?
That's a great question, and I would love to hear your answer to it as well. I think this is just so crucial, and it's something that I've been thinking about a little bit more. We really have to make defense contractor money toxic, accepting it both, in PACs and direct donations, and the weapons industry. And, I don't like to call it the defense industry, because it implies we're defending ourselves when we're really, often the aggressors. But the weapons and arms industry pours millions and millions of dollars every year into lobbying Congress, and also into campaign contributions. And that's not really, talked about. And then that investment, that they're making goes directly back into their pockets, because we're doing, direct appropriations to defense contractors for building weapons and providing systems and, and things like that. And but in both in and out of war zones. And so we really we really need some more sunlight on this issue. We need to be it's sort of a campaign that is sort of in its nascent stages. I know there's like a lot of great work that the Project on Government Oversight does, POGO, and we try to highlight this dynamic whenever possible, but there's really, I think, a lot more that we could be doing to talk about the corruption that's inherent in our Pentagon budget. So great question. And, let's do it together.
Agreed. I think we just have to keep chipping away. And I absolutely love the work that the Project on Government Oversight is doing. I think we need to be working more closely wherever possible with folks in Congress who are doing the oversight work and continuing to raise the issue of government contractors. I think I always go back to, Dwight Eisenhower's speech on the military industrial complex. He foresaw this. He was a general. He saw, the issues related to war, and he was very concerned with, how we had turned all of our manufacturing in this country. And, this was the big jobs creator. And so, he really foresaw these issues coming. So reminders from people who are veterans and who have seen, the horrors of war, who have raised these alarms over and over again. I think we need to keep bringing that up as well. So thank you. I'm going to pass it back off to Rakia to close us out and give our legislators some reminders of things coming down the line, but have so appreciated your time, Erica.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Erica and Mac, for that great discussion and wonderful overview of the federal budget and why there is such a need to let Congress know, especially now, why massive defense budget increases have an impact on our ability to meet the needs of our communities. Erica, I really appreciated the examples you gave on how just a 10% cut in the Pentagon budget would give us what we need to cover homelessness, our gaps in education, infrastructure, just to name a few from the website that you gave. And I actually dug that website up, and I'm going to go ahead and share it to our legislators so that they can take a look at that when they get a chance. I think that's a really useful resource. Let me drop that for everybody. And so as a quick reminder to our legislators, there is still time to sign on to our letter going to Congress, which will be outlining some of the concerns that you heard here, as well as some others that we have spelled out in the letter. Just to say them here, there are 3 demands that we have that we're basically asking of Congress. And so the first one is to pause funding for upgrades to nuclear weapons systems. The second is to decrease our top line defense spending by 10%. And the third would be to terminate wasteful defense contracts, just to kind of double tap that on the last point that Erica and Mac just made there. And so we'll be collecting signatures through June 30th and send the letter with all of our signatures to Congress by July 1st. You can find the full letter and the link to sign on at our website, which is wan.org.